Hi, folks. Welcome to another edition of the Omnist Hour. Um, hadn't planned on making a podcast today, but a couple of things I was watching on YouTube kind of set my mind in motion on new direction, a new way of approaching what I'm trying to convince you of in my channel. So I decided to pull up an image of the Parthenon and talk about the physics of karma. And essentially, what I intend to do today is to prove to you that everything I'm talking about is absolutely consistent with any logical, rational, observational, scientific view of the multiverse. Okay, here we go. So, let's think about classical physics for a little bit. What are some of the principles that are pretty well accepted? I'm going to talk about one in particular, which, in essence, is one way of stating uh, one of the fundamental facets of karma. Do you remember in your high school physics class when you learned that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction? One of the basic laws of force. Come to mind? Okay. And this is a law that applies to all forces. At least did until materialist science started butting up against social science and quantum mechanics and cosmology in the sense of, okay, well, we think there's something like this big bang that happened, and all of a sudden there was this explosion of activity. And similarly, the quantum mechanical world saw things that were kind of inconsistent with equal and opposite. I mean, we were already aware of that the second that we got a hint that our universe was matter and not antimatter. And antimatter seems to be very rare and difficult to create and keep around in this universe. Okay, so there was a point at which many sciences went off the rails with either traditional religious or traditional anti religious explanations for nature. And as science was on the ascendancy in the last few years, few hundred years, and spirituality was kind of being demonized, science sort of stepped in and forced its way of thinking in spite of evidence that seemed to go against the laws of physics. And folks, kind of stopped thinking about this law of equal and opposite reaction in their theories about what's going on, in their theories about evolution, in their theories about quantum mechanics, in their theories about cosmology, astrophysics. In every direction, this is essentially how our species has been going off the rails more and more rapidly with time. Because once you accept the cognitive dissonance that comes with rejecting a fundamental truth, that cognitive dissonance in your fundamental thinking clouds everything else you do. Okay, so equal and opposite reaction. This is observable, verifiable, and absolutely true of everything we see that follows classical Newtonian mechanics, which is most of what happens in the macro world that we observe day in and day out. Okay, how does this manifest in political terms? When one party, one power gets the ascendancy, it creates pressure against it because power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is another fundamental truth that goes with this law. Okay? It is part of this equal and opposite reaction law. If you build up pressure of power, if you force a solution because you have the power to force it, eventually that force will be countered by another force. Now, here's where it gets complicated. The equal and opposite reaction may happen visibly within the view of your perspective, which is a perspective of a human who has very limited lifetime, very limited perception of nature. You're saying, wait, no, I see everything. And no, this is very true. You only see a very small fragment of the electromagnetic spectrum. Visible light is a small portion of what other detectors are capable of, than your eyes are capable of noticing. Similarly, there's a lot more information in what you get than your brain allows you to process, because your brain is a filter more than anything else. It's a filter on the mass of information coming in from your other senses, from your eyes, ears, nose, and spiritual sense, which some people refer to as sixth sense. Your brain is a filter of all that, because if it all was coming in as raw information, you would be like a computer that was completely overloaded with information and unable to process any of it, not having the time to process any of it before what you were processing became irrelevant because more data was coming in. Okay, so what ways does the equal and opposite reaction of karma come into play in a human sense? Okay, well, civilizations come to become dominant. Certain political organizations become dominant, or, well, I mean, essentially every human organization is political, right? The whole point of organizing is to have more power for your organization than the organizations you're competing against. More influence. Human organization is about power. Absolutely, without question. If you think it's not, you're a fool. You're blind to your own tribe's pursuit of power. Okay, so human organizations can become very powerful, can't they? And it may seem that they've completely conquered the known world. That's probably what the Catholic Church thought before things started falling off the rails and the counter force came to balance out what they were doing. And it's done, I mean, basically the invention of Islam was a counter to the Catholic Church, the influence of the Catholic Church. The split between Catholic and Orthodox Christianity was an opposite reaction in a way. Every heresy that's had to be put down was evidence of this pressure of a trying to be equal and opposite reaction. And just because it got put down does not mean that that pressure goes away. It just builds. And every wall you build around the pressure, opposing force is going to make that force act more violently once the wall comes down. So, how does that fit into any sort of a spiritual context? Imagine, if you will, a spiritual being, a god, thinking about the government of souls, the government of other spiritual beings who have independent minds, their own thoughts. Now, a spiritual being that understood this law of equal and opposite reaction would not be the one that pushed their solution on everybody else. Because you know what would happen? If God tried to be an authoritarian, micromanaging megalomaniac, like we've seen so many of in the last 100 years, and also even further back in history, one would know that that is not the way to achieve anything lasting. You can look all the way back to Alexander the Great to prove that. If Alexander had lived longer, there were several assassination attempts during his life, and a fair amount of circumstantial evidence that the illness he finally succumbed to was in fact murder. And in fact, his father was assassinated, maybe by partisans of his mother, who were afraid, now that his father had remarried and had another son, that Alexander would not be the inheritor. If you look at any political situation, any religious situation, any conflict in all of our history, and it is this equal and opposite reaction characteristic that inevitably causes civilizations to fall, causes religions to come into discredit and be challenged. Okay, so the inventor of this law of karma, this law of physics, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. The inventor of karma was one who would see, oh, if I want this law to be accepted, I better not push it. I'll mention it as something that I think might be useful, and I will start implementing it privately, peacefully, among the handful of souls that have come to agree and are willing to participate in experimenting with this new idea. Now, if you remember the last talk, I talked about the beginning of the universe and how one of the big questions for scientists is, how did this Big Bang happen? When it seems to violate every principle of equal and opposite reaction, it seems to beg the question, well, if everything began with a Big Bang, what happened before that? And there's a lot of speculation. One of the areas of speculation that actually makes the most sense and fits with the law of karma is that there is an alternate universe where the antimatter became prevalent, where maybe their dark matter is light matter, and our light matter, our dark matter, is the antithesis of their darkness. Okay, and as I told you, this is exactly how it works. And in practice, the subsequent experiments in perfecting karma alternate between using the anti God universe and the God universe as either the current copy, the current best version, or the current experimental version, which might or might not come up with something better, might result in a cataclysm. You following me? Okay, so essentially, I am giving you every which way to prove that karma is very real. And if you want to prove reincarnation is very, very real, you only have to look at the work of Dr. Ian Stevenson, a very accomplished scientist who set out to study the evidence of past lives through looking at the small number of children who have some remembrance of strong remembrance of a past life until they get to be about 6 years oldish. Then they seem to fade for some reason. I'm not blowing smoke up your ass. I'm not proposing something that I can't defend. And, if you don't have to believe me, but you're gonna find out that it's true when you die. Because your experience of the between, the spiritual world, is going to be consistent with your karmic needs. And as I've told you, that's why there are parts of heaven that are designed for guiding Christian souls, for guiding atheist souls, for guiding every kind of soul there is. And the reason for that, the reason that those heavens exist, is because of this final law of karma, which we've been implementing as part of this experiment that humanity is the guinea pig chosen species for. The final part of karma, which is being tested locally here and has been proven, is the part that governs virtual universes and virtual souls. Okay? Virtual universes have existed since the first two souls started working on this idea. That's how the Big Bang happened. That's how physical reality started becoming reality. Once that physical reality was expanded enough to let a few more souls in on the experiment, then the experiments started being conducted within one or the other universe in a very localized test tube. The first test tubes maybe were galactic clusters, and then galaxies, and then solar systems, and then planets. Progressively more localized, smaller experiments honing in on creating a soul vehicle like humanity that was tuned for the final experiment with expanding the idea of a virtual universe from the very first one, where these alternate experiments started happening, to one where the experiments of advanced souls, the ones that have a lot of power, could happen in their own test universe. Just like God and the first anti God set up the very first experiment in karma. Now, where we've got to today with humanity is we have a lot of baggage that's been created by this experiment, because this is one of the last experiments that's going to have to be conducted, last spiritual experiments that will need to be conducted with a specialized planet. It takes a long time to condition a planet to be the test bed for a very complex experiment like this. You've got to assemble a lot of different species. You've got to assemble just the right conditions, just the right environment. You've got to uh, develop this intelligent species that somehow lacks all of the spiritual awareness and knowledge and power that the species that were working on creating them had. And then you've got to turn on this creation of virtual souls and virtual universes and let this species test it. What happens when you're testing that? Well, here's how karma works in its final version, which has been active in humanity for quite some time. Souls within this experiment, some of them who have come from outside the experiment, from previous versions of karma, or from a pre-karma version of the multiverse that only had reincarnation, without any sense of the responsibility, the equal and opposite reaction of karma, coming to play in this little experiment. As they play in this experiment, as they do things that violate karma, in other words, they try to force situations to suit themselves or their organization, they create energy that pulls them away from God's universe, because God, the creator of karma, got this whole thing to happen without using force. If God had used force to implement karma, it would never have come to any kind of a fair conclusion. It would have been a version of karma that would create the pressure for a Buddhist religion to crop up, a religion based on the fallacy that reincarnation and karma are bad things that you want to avoid. And therefore, you should live each incarnation trying to get to some imaginary place called nirvana where you can avoid karma. This is an example of how equal and opposite reaction happens to force. The law of karma, like all the laws of the universe, you can observe the speed of light, the Planck constant, the value of pi, the incredible rules of mathematics, the structure that we see in the fractal patterns of life, of the whole multiverse, are the result of laws that have been proven in by spreading to the entire multiverse. How do you spread a law to the entire multiverse? Well, you have to create a law that doesn't produce opposite reactions, because the opposite reactions will cancel out or will bound a law to a particular place. So the law only applies in one universe or applies on one planet or in one galaxy. And to the extent that we experiment with new ideas, we're creating localized laws which we're trying to promote globally. That's what the human species does with politics, with religion, with all of its creations. It tries to make something that is universally appealing. And most of the time fails. When it fails spectacularly, there are times where the equal and opposite reaction to the achievements of one species on their planet is the destruction of that planet, either because of the planet's own pressure to restore an equilibrium against the force of some species that is risking its life, or externally because precocious species is developing technologies that it's not obviously not going to be using responsibly when it encounters other species that are developing in their own way on other planets. Okay, so what I'm getting at here is there is absolutely no reason not to believe what I'm telling you. I'm not some crazy ass preacher of a new religion. I'm telling you what the science of spirituality is, what the science of religion is. The only way that we could have got here with an intelligent creator or creators. And it's a way that's consistent with the fundamental ideas behind every religion, to the extent that it has ideas in it that weren't captured and modified and misused for cultural Marxist purposes. In other words, taking some truth and turning it into a lie to support your idea of power. And this is essentially what cultural Marxism is: spreading a lie, retelling stories, retelling the truth, clouded with a power lie. This is absolutely what is going on now. It's going on with what's happening with the pandemic. It's going on with what's happening with the financial system. It's going on with what's happening with social media. It's going on with what's happening in Ukraine, of which you're not getting the full story from either side, or the sides which are really orchestrating the whole thing, which are the global elites who are scrambling to see who the new designated godfathers and godmothers are now that China, under Xi Jinping, has tipped its hand and shown that they're not the humble, sweet, second rate players in the game that they pretended to be. And the pandemic, the truth of it is that Western global elites, when technology that they were developing, dark, dystopian technologies they were developing under the umbrella of organizations like the CIA and secret military efforts, the NIH, CDC, all of these three-letter corporate organizations that are the real power in our government, started getting some attention from Congress back in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s. And this is when, if you'll remember, all of this interesting stuff started happening with the Soviet Union. the Glasnost era, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Hallelujah, communism is dead. Surprisingly, only about 10 years after, roughly, the deep state, led by Kissinger, made this crazy deal with the Chinese communists and started enabling their economy, throwing large amounts of money, giving them all sorts of advantage, arguing, oh, it's because, it's a third world country and they need our help and we're doing such good. And look what wonderful globalist people we are. We're kumbaya, blah, 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 blah. Okay, that's the way they sold it in the news. That's the way they were trying to sell it up to the point where the pandemic happened and all of a sudden their narrative went off the rails. This is when we discovered that this virus was made in a lab in Wuhan, and it was made under a contract which government organizations in the US organized. A contract that was so dystopian that DARPA rejected it first, and they had to get funding through the NIH and pull every string that they had up to the level of Dr. Fauci, the PR mouthpiece of corporate pharma, which is a cartel that is very, very closely tied to the military-industrial complex, because Big Pharma is the bioweapons research arm of the military-industrial complex. And their whole reason for existing is to control humanity through fear, through propaganda, through biological manipulation to become the species that the global elite would like it to be. And that is exactly what elite members of a species do that drive it toward becoming a hive species. Bees, ants are examples of hive species you're very familiar with. How does a hive-minded species work? There are specialized members of that species that are crafted, are programmed to do the work and to worship the queen and the queen's entourage. And yes, entourages do happen. If you look inside an anthill, inside a beehive, there are certain members of this entourage that cluster around the queen and serve their every need and make them feel wonderful and bring all the food to the queen so the queen doesn't have to touch the lowly workers or deal with the soldiers directly. And this is exactly how the global elite is programming humanity. Now, how does this fit into the whole idea of karma? Well, you might ask that. This whole idea of a hive species, an intelligent hive species, was one of the earlier steps in proving out the need for this, what would have seemed like a very drastic step to have virtual universes and virtual souls as a way of saying, okay, you've gone so far off the rails in your abuse of karma and you're trying to take control of the universe for your idea of perfection that you need to go to a timeout. We do this in nature too. I mean, this is the whole reason we have laws and prisons. And we try to put criminals behind bars. We try to isolate them so they can't do bad things anymore. And where we run into trouble is in trying to figure out what things are bad and to try to figure out how to enforce a good set of laws uh, equally, fairly, without developing a prejudicial system that favors those in power. At any rate, I would hope that if you're listening to this, you start trying to view what's going on around you from this viewpoint of equal and opposite reactions and that tie between that and karma. If you are part of a group that is trying to assert your worldview, your dream of good power, good government, good anything, and you're willing to do evil to do it, to kill others, to lie to others, to cheat, you're not playing this game of karma in a way that's going to keep you in God's universe. Your soul will eventually be marked as one of the beasts or the servants of beasts that is going to be put into timeout in all the universes outside of God's universe that other senior creators have built using their own particular biases. The biases of some gods are towards participative and evolutionary improvements of God's universe. They appreciate karma and they work with it, not against it, to experiment with finding new things to contribute to God's universe that are consistent with the laws of the multiverse, that are consistent with karma, with the beauty of the divine fractal, the pattern that is underlying the entire universe. That's why some art looks very beautiful and other art looks like shit. Fine, create all kinds of stuff, but understand that the only things that are going to be lasting, permanent, are the things that are integrated into God's universe. The stuff going on in these other universes is all part of what's going to be a very, very, very long cleanup phase till all souls are basically creating in consistency with truth, with what works and what doesn't. I mean, that's basically how you stay close to God's universe, because you don't get anything integrated into God's universe that won't stand up to the test of implementation. And that is why multiple universes exist now. That's how they will continue to exist. And gradually, as the gods of those universes and the folks that they talk into playing their game and coming to their universe to play their games will eventually realize that they keep creating piles of sand that don't hold up. And you get kind of depressed with that, like a disappointed Buddhist. And eventually you decide, you know what? I don't want to play this game anymore. I'm going to try to find a game that is more satisfying. And there's no game more satisfying than contributing to God's universe, to workable creation. Not the creation of fantasies, not the creation of some la 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 beautiful fairy tale. those are fine. Go ahead and create those. They're good stories for children to the extent that they don't keep those children thinking that, the world is full of rainbow unicorns. And all we have to do is turn everybody into a rainbow unicorn and everything's going to be perfect. Let's see. I think that's all I wanted to talk about today. I'm going to keep this one fairly short. I want to go get back to my family, but I hope you find that useful. Again, like, share, subscribe, comment, whatever. I'm more than happy to interact with anybody who wants to talk about this stuff because I think it's more important than anything else that humanity is busy engaged in right now because we don't have much longer to chart our own course forward before the end of the seventh day of creation and the beginning of the eighth. And as I told you in yesterday's podcast, that demarcation point is going to be when we stop, humanity stops being a test vehicle for karma and is challenged to be an implementation vehicle for karma. And at that point, if humanity continues to exist, it will exist as a God species who is spreading the truth of the real God in God's universe. And any portions of this species that aren't on board with that mission going forward are not going to be participating in this species in God's universe. They're going to be off in some other alternate universe, an alternate timeline that might look very, very dystopian, exactly like some of the dark visions that previous civilizations have had of this time. I don't wish that on anybody. And that's why I'm here talking to you, because you don't have much longer to make your decision. A lot of you have already made a decision, and it's a foregone conclusion. You're either going to step over the line and get replaced by a virtual soul, never to return to the species, or you're going to die, and on the heaven side, you're going to find out where you belong and get coached into that particular tribe and go work within that particular universe if you're not really up to competing in God's universe, up to being a real creator, not a creator of useless fantasies. I mean, go ahead and do what you want to do, but if I'm reaching anybody with this and making sense to them, making sense of what they're passionate about, what's gyrating within them about the cognitive dissonance that they face, maybe I'm helping somebody. I don't know. Uh, we are heading towards what is very definitely might be considered a singularity. They talk about that in scientific circles. They talk about that in information technology circles. Everybody's got an idea of this singularity we're heading for. I'm telling you what it is and how you need to start thinking if you want to have any control over where you end up after this singularity hits its final phase. And we head into this eighth day, this new phase of the purpose of humanity. Anyway, that's it for the Omnist Hour. I'll catch you next time. Till then, happy karma.